So not much is known about the book of Hebrews. It's the scripture that we hear this morning. We don't know where it was written. We don't know who it was written to. We don't know the author. Sometimes scholars can kind of parse together these things and figure out where or what particular community or what the concern is. All that we know from this scripture is that the preacher was preaching to a group of people who were discouraged, who needed to be lifted up and encouraged. And that's where the whole image of the cloud of witnesses and the litany of saints comes. I confess that it happens to be a lesson for the day, but it's also a good one for me because I've been a bit discouraged. I've found this to be a fairly discouraging summer in many ways. There have been personally many delightful highs. My daughter graduated from college June 5th, got a great job working for the Ohio Democratic Party. She's just having the time of her life. But on that morning, one of the great Americans, David Gilkey, photographer from NPR who was in Afghanistan covering the war, trying to keep that conflict in front of the American people, was killed in an ambush. We've used his images before on our bulletin cover, and the thought of his parents and his 50-year-old loss has really touched me. And then there's been the ongoing kind of conflict and violence that we've seen that's been hard to turn away from. You know, you see a young man killed in Minneapolis by police who had been pulled over Philando Castile almost 50 times by police for really minor things, like pulling too far in the intersection. This cafeteria worker who tried to feed kids. And, you know, we can parse that out and kind of figure it out. And then somehow, like the report this week about the growing and just entrenched divide between white and black Americans when it comes to wealth. I don't know how many of you saw that, but this is not because one group works hard and one group doesn't work hard. It's because we know of systemic policies that have kept black people from buying and people of color from buying houses in certain areas where there was segregation, and those were the areas where housing values climbed. It's kept people out of good jobs. And good. So the wealth divide, you may have seen that. This is not like some namby-pamby left-wing group. This is just the truth of economics. The average black family will need 200 years to catch up to the average wealth of a white family. So I found this summer being sort of a time when it feels like, oh my gosh, are things going to get better? Is there any hope? And in that, you hear this word that reminds us that we're not at this because we think we're going to see it in our lifetime, that we're at this because faith and hope is something very real inside of us that keeps calling us. We're not the first people to go up against difficult moments or difficult times. So these words are in some ways among some of the most beautiful in Scripture. It starts off with this kind of passage. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. And then it goes on, the whole chapter kind of talks about all different people who set out by faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as inheritance. And he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed for a long time in land where he had been promised. It goes on and on. He was almost dead. Sarah herself was barren. But therefore, for one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as stars of heaven, and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. And it goes on. All of these died in faith without having received the promises. But from a distance, they saw and greeted them. I mean, it's like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. You know, I've been to the top of the mountaintop. I've looked over. I can see the promised land. I might not get there with you, but you will get there. And the passage goes on, talking about Moses, hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child was beautiful. You know, it goes on and on and on. What more should I say? For time would fail to tell me of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept a release in order to obtain a better resurrection. I mean, you know, you think people weren't discouraged, mocked and flogged, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. I mean, this isn't my average week. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all of these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. So it was 1991, and the wars in El Salvador were just ending. And if you recall anything about that, El Salvador, small country about the size of Massachusetts, they had like 75,000 people killed during the Civil War. So we had gone there as a delegation of people to kind of hear about folks' journey and folks' desire to rebuild, and also to come as Americans and to say, you know, we had some complicity in this war. We were actually funding, you know, the military that in many ways committed many atrocities against the people. And so for about a week, maybe it was 2 weeks, we traveled around going from one community to another, hearing people's stories. And everywhere we went, it was kind of the same thing. It was like, if you imagine a country that's been through a decade of war, it's bombed out, it's craters, there's very little to eat. It reminded me in many ways of a person's body that had just been beaten up and bruised and scarred and kind of ripped open. And we would go from one community to another, and everywhere it was the same thing. You've heard me talk about this. People would bring us too much food, way more food than we could eat, and they didn't have food. There was the beans and the rice, and then there would be in every single village a directiva, a little town council, and we would sit down and they would want to tell us their story. I mean, that was what they wanted, was to say, bear witness, let me tell you what happened to me. And the stories, tragically, were always very similar. They would start with disappearances, with people being taken from the community, then there would be death squads, and there would be tortures, and there would be burnings of the crops. And you know, we went from one village to another, bearing witness. And there was also incredible hope and resilience everywhere you went. Well, by the time we got to the very last village, I mean, we were just exhausted. We went up, and everywhere you went, the further and the deeper into the mountains, the more desperate it became. The more desperate, the hungrier, the skinnier, the more, it just very tough conditions. And we finally made it to the top of this village, El Higueral. Some of you have heard me talk about that. And we were 4 hours. This was one of those hikes. We were with the young, you know, kind of AmeriCorps worker type person. Oh, it'll take us an hour. 4.5 hours, you know. Oh man, people were barely making it. We got up there so much later than we were supposed to be. We thought, well, thankfully, everybody will be asleep. We won't have to eat. We won't have to hear stories. No. Of course, the whole village had waited up. So we had to eat. And then we think, surely we're not going to hear more stories. Well, we heard more stories. And it was like, it was just so, I remember going into this thatched hut and being so incredibly, it has been 25 years ago, and I can still remember the people sharing the stories. They remembered exactly the day the army came, the priests taking over the village, the desperation. This group of people were close to Honduras, but they didn't cross the border because it was too dangerous. Instead, they lived in the hills like deer for 6-7 years, and they talked about seeing their children starve to death, and then finally being able to come back and returning. And I can still remember sitting in a circle on the floor, and there was a tiny little lantern, and in the light of that lantern, there was a little bug, and its wing was bent. I mean, a bug that would be no count to anyone, and I can still remember cheering for that bug to make it. I mean, it was just like you wanted life to win. And I remember finally going to sleep, laying down in this, you know, where again you thought, but you know, then you realize everyone in the village is giving you their hammock, so you can sleep on this hammock while they're somewhere on the floor. And it's hot, it's stifling, and there's chickens and, you know, crying and babies. And I remember laying next to Pauline Dolan, the lovely woman in the town who is from Kansas City, but grew up between El Salvador and Boston, coming from a wealthy family that had come back there. And I said, why would anybody come back here? Why would anybody come back here? And she said, because there used to be something here. Because there used to be something here. And they believed there would be something there someday in the future. And I remember the next day when the sun came up and you could look out and you could see the beauty of the hills and the mountains, looking into the future. And the people took us around and they showed us all their dreams. At that point, they just had a little school that was at first grade level. There was no one in the village who could speak or who could write or read beyond the first grade level. They had plans. They had plans to one day have a high school and one day have adult literacy programs. And over here, they were going to plant crops and they were going to have corn, they were going to have rice, and they were going to have beans, and they were going to have a medical clinic, and on and on. They would have industry. And you could, I mean, it was nothing that you could see with the human eye. And that's what the scripture says. Who hopes for what you see? I mean, something you can see, that's not hope. Hope is what you can't see, right? Faith is the assurance of things not seen. It's the conviction conviction of things you don't yet have. That's faith, that's hope. It's believing in something that is not yet here. The Greek word is this word hypostasis. That's the word for faith, that's assurance. It actually means that you feel in the future what is here. You feel it as if it is here right now. So right now, you can see Kansas City. You can see every kid going back to school with enough to eat. Right now, you can see classrooms well-resourced and all kinds of activities. Right now, you can see economic development, Easter right now. That's what it means. It means you can taste it like your grandmother's fried pie right this minute. And it's not that these people were naive or Pollyanna. That's not it. Did you hear the list of people who had suffered, who were lifted up? Abraham and Sarah. It said they were all but dead. They were old. They had no chance of a future. They were barren and lost, and God called them to leave this land. If they had wanted a sure thing, they would have gone back, but no, they went forward. And barren Sarah gave birth to a child. And before you knew it, children and grandchildren and descendants as vast as the heavens. And then Moses. I mean, we know his story. Everybody's got that down. Talk about adversity, how he brought the slaves out of freedom. This is Harriet Tubman, folks. This isn't just some kind. This is bringing feet with the dogs chasing you, trying to get you, right? I mean, this is John Lewis going across that bridge. People beating on you. That's what it is. That's that kind of adversity. And Moses, he doesn't just bring the slaves out of, it was his own birth, too. He talked about that, how that word Egypt, coming out of Egypt, it's Mitzrayim, it's the birth canal. He had to first come out of his own place of desperation and loss to move into this promised land that God hoped for him. This was one of the weeks when I had been cheering for God. I mean, the whole week, Monday, some folks here during that event, I had a funeral for a 1-year-old, for a 1-month-old. What do you say? I mean, the baby gifts are still coming, right? The FedEx driver bringing them on. And then there's the family gathered to mourn the loss of this future, this child. What could you say but that it was a beautiful family, a litany of saints? What could you say but that there was a mother there who was determined to care for her daughter who was grieving, and grandparents too, who were saying we will go forward. We will create even a better world for those children who are still here. And I shared at the funeral that the mother, the grandmother, who's a little younger than me, when I went to call on the family, she had an I voted sticker Tuesday. She had gone out to vote, Cindy Hulsher, our candidate there, 3 days after this incredible loss of her life. And there she was, I voted. And I thought, really? How did you have the courage to do that? And then Tuesday, I sat with a good friend, Jennifer. This woman, she's so bright and sharp. And in recent years, as she sort of claimed her own story, she's beginning to kind of share a little bit more. When she was a young woman, like too many young women of her age, having no volition and no control over her body, over anything that had happened to her body, she had her child taken from her. She had no control over that, like a lot of women of her age, from Australia, the United States, to Canada, and all in between. She had her child taken from her. She had no chance to recover the son. And she longed for him for 40-something years, until a year ago when she decided, using her journalism skills and her research and her wisdom, that she was gonna find that guy. She was gonna find him. She knew what day he was born. She went to the state of Missouri. She was able to pull up the 140 names of the sons who were born to women on that day. She started making notes, and she worked with an agency in Florida. And somehow, out of all the notes she made, the person said, go with your gut. And there was one name out of the 140. She had written a note off to the left. So she started there, and it turned out that was her son. And a year ago, she wrote him a letter. Turns out he went to Dartmouth, Ivy League, incredible young man, had every opportunity in the world. She was careful the day she sent the letter. She wanted it to get there on a Friday night when he was done with the work week in Manhattan, wherever he was. A few hours later, she got a LinkedIn message. Mom, They began corresponding. They were going to see each other. All this community, all that could be. And just before she was going to go see him last fall, she got another call from his wife's sister, and he had died of a massive heart attack. Never held him, never saw him. Instead, she flew to where he was. She was there just in time for the funeral, touched his casket, the only other time she ever touched his body. And she has said to me that somehow she knows she will see him again. She doesn't know what that means. Her faith, like many of our faiths, is just this hope, this longing. And yet, in that longing to see him again, she's also committed herself. I met her at a political campaign, a political event, trying to create a different kind of world, trying to say I can't just be totally absorbed, trying to say what it says in the scripture, that they all desired a better country. They desired a better country. Since God had provided something better so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Then I think of my friend. Eden was going with her son to France 2 years ago, and higher on Xanax than any kid ever should be. He committed his first ever crime, went into these pharmacies, robbing them of the Xanax, and he's still not been sentenced. 2 years later, they still don't know what's going to happen to Max. He's been sentenced by one county and sentenced by another, but there's still a third one holding out. And I met with her on Thursday before her son's last sentencing. And she just said, you know, this experience has taught me how little control I have. You know, and it's also taught her again in a different way how unjust and wrong the system is. To not have books in the Kansas City, Missouri jail. To not have books. To not have any opportunity to grow and learn. And she wants what every mother wants. She wants to see her son. She wants to be out. She wants to be able to help him in that next transition as he hopefully comes out one day and begins a new life. And she said, I want to get this settled so I can start investing my own time and energy in creating a better system for other parents and other kids who, of course, don't have the resources they have. She desires a better country. That's what the scripture is about. We are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. How could we ever be discouraged? How many people work for the vote for how many years? How many people today would love to feed their families? How can we ever be discouraged? There are so many people whose faith is so big and so rich and so deep. I want, like Paul said, to someday be counted among the saints. I want my kids to grow up, think, mother stood in there, mother kept going, mother never gave up. I want to live by that hope. I don't want to live by the discouragement that sometimes beats me down. I want to remember that faith is not what we see and what we have and what we taste in our lifetime. It's investing ourselves in the promise that God has promised for all creation. Thankful for this gift, for these saints. For all that you give me, day after day, week after week, encouragement and love and grace. May we share it richly.